Lord of the Mysteries. Chapter 588. Old Acquaintance. It's you? Upon hearing this surprised and curious female voice, Klein jumped in fright, imagining that he had been recognized by someone. He immediately composed himself because he had already changed his appearance to that of the deceased Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. And inside Kalangos was the crazy adventurer, Gairman Sherlock. And inside Gairman Sparrow was the identity of the great detective, Sherlock Moriarty. And inside Sherlock Moriarty was the identity of Klein Moretti. This wasn't the end. Deep within Klein Moretti was Mr. Fool as well as Zhou Mingrui. There's no reason that she can directly see my true essence. Besides, how can she know of a trivial character like Klein Moretti? Even Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos wouldn't have left the Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's helper surprised. To be specially invited by a Sequence 5 pirate admiral to protect herself and deal with her enemy, the person must be at least a Sequence 4 demigod. Therefore, that sentence was directed at Mr. Azek? That high-ranking demoness recognizes Mr. Azek, who had destroyed their cooperation with the royal family and Ince Zangwell in Backland, or does she recognizes him from one of his former lives? Klein quickly cleared his train of thoughts and remained guarded against Tracy and her helper's sudden attacks. He also looked through the corner of his eye to observe Mr. Azek's reaction. He wasn't too surprised that a mysterious powerhouse would appear. Firstly, this was because Mr. Azek had already given a warning, and secondly, it was because he believed that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy wasn't a self-conceited person. To almost be assassinated without knowing the assassin's backing faction and motive, there was a high probability that she would leave the sea around the Rorstad archipelago to seek help from the upper echelons of the Demonist sect. The only thing Hadden expected was that her helper would arrive so quickly. It was as though she was nearby or had a mystical item like that of a traveler. Combining the female characteristics of the voice and the gentleness within it, Klein suspected that it was a demoness at the demigod level. Azek stood on the thick carpet and said after 2 seconds of hesitation, "You know me?" This tone sounds uncertain. Could it be that my big shot had once spent a period of time with a demoness? No, I can't think of it that way. Klein began to imagine things before he seriously felt penitent for having those thoughts. He noticed that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy wore an aghast look. Her certainty and calm had turned into puzzlement. The gentle female voice sounded out from an unknown location again. "I obviously know you. You should also know me." Azek turned his ears to the side to listen before he shook his head and gave a rueful smile. "I'm sorry. I've repeatedly lost my memories and am in the midst of recovering them. If you can remind me and invoke more of my memories, I'll be very grateful to you." Upon hearing their conversation, Tracy's puzzled and confused look settled. She cautiously swept her gaze at Klein but frowned when she saw Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos' face. The gentle female voice sighed. "The last time we met was 1,300 years ago. Back then, Primordial and Death were working together, instigating the Pale Disaster in the northern continent. You might have already forgotten that we once fought the saints and angels of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. I know this piece of history. It was recorded in Emperor Rosel's diary," Mr. Dorr said. "That it resulted in the primordial demoness being heavily injured, and she had only managed to descend only in recent times. As for Death, he directly perished and created the Berserk Sea that separated the northern and southern continents. The demoness sect and the forces of Death had previously cooperated, so it's no wonder that a demigod-ranked demoness knows Mr. Azek. Man, she's also a monster that has lived for at least 1,400 years. Klein thought with a creative mind. Following that, he felt puzzled again. He originally imagined that Mr. Azek had suffered heavy injuries from being glanced at Blood Emperor Alista Tudor during the War of the Four Emperors, which resulted in him constantly losing his memory and forgetting his past. However, what the demigod-ranked demoness indicated was that not only did Azek survive the War of the Four Emperors, but he had even participated in the Pale Disaster many years later. He didn't seem to have any problems in between. Azek closed his eyes as though he was trying to squeeze out his memories. After a few seconds, he asked hesitantly, Katerina Pell? You are already a demoness of unaging? I'm very happy that you can still remember me. I could only be considered a weakling compared to you back then. A figure outlined itself beside Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. She wore a simple and pure white gown which had high slits that revealed her flawless legs. Her skin was as white as snow and as tender as a young maiden's. The woman had black hair and blue eyes, and she looked elegant and pretty. She had an indescribable charm. She looked towards Isaac Eggers as a faint smile curled at the corner of her lips. More than 1,000 years have passed. It's a cause for celebration for us to meet alive. Balam Empire's Mr. Death Consul. Mr. Isaac was Balam Empire's Death Consul. This is the name of a later potion in the death pathway? This demoness of unaging Katerina Pell looks like she's in her 30s. She's elegant and pure, yet she exudes a mature charm. Wait, why am I thinking of this? Her pleasure charms are already that potent? Klein hurriedly moved his gaze away and nearly had to use cogitation to calm his emotions. Without waiting for Isaac to say a word, Katerina Pell said with a melodic voice, I'm curious over why you would still be constantly losing your memories. I remember that it only happens for your pathway during the undying stage. Dying once every 60 years to revive again and forget the past. However, you have long advanced past that and escaped from that curse. What happened to you at the end of the Pale disaster? Heh, the 7 gods had fractured back then and treated each other as enemies. We both believed that Primordial and Death would succeed, but who knew that the proudest son and the most arrogant tyrant would bow their heads? They quickly joined forces again. If I hadn't managed to advance by chance, then I might have already perished at the end of that divine battle. I believe you should have suffered some damage which resulted in your present state. Death's perishing is itself the greatest injury for you. Isaac fell silent as he wore an indistinct, painful expression. I can't remember. At this moment, Klein realized that Katerina Pell looked somewhat familiar, and he suspected her of being the white-robed lady who had led Madame Sharon onto the path of a demoness. Suddenly, Katerina's eyes turned to sweep a glance at Klein. She chuckled at Isaac and said, I believe you haven't forgotten the reason for visiting today? I'm very curious why he would assassinate Tracy. Could it be for justice? The glance the demoness of unaging swept over was filled with hidden amorousness and sweet playfulness. She resembled an underage young maiden, and her facial features and bearing had magically accentuated that feeling. She didn't have the jarring feeling of a mature lady acting young at all. At that moment, Klein viewed her as a maiden who was 16 or 17. She can already perfectly present every charm a woman can bring. She has the skin, facial features, and bearing to match it. As expected of a demoness of unaging, Klein had already attempted to use cogitation to resist this indescribable charm. He took the initiative to look at ailment maiden Tracy. Do you know the tycoon named Jimmy Necker? Tracy gaped her mouth before closing it again. She replied blankly and aggrieved. Who is he? You might not know him. He once collected a batch of ancient chronicles related to death. He died at the hands of Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, Klein said while bearing the appearance of Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. Tracy narrowed her eyes. She wore a dazed look before turning angry. You came for those documents? It really is in your hands. Klein determined based on her tone. He answered indifferently. That's right. Tracy inhaled slightly and said, Where's Helene? Did you do anything to her? I know she's still alive. If something happens to her, my spiritual intuition will tell me. Klein didn't attempt to speak ambiguously as he directly answered her. She has already returned to Intis to lead a brand new life. Tracy's expression sank. A storm raged in her eyes as the aura of a pirate admiral fully revealed itself. However, Isaac casually swept his gaze over and instantly made her calm down. The corners of her lips curled up. That batch of documents from the mausoleum of the Balam Empire's royalty is indeed in my hands. But I wasn't interested in it. I flipped through it casually before handing it to the sect. Even if you had succeeded in assassinating me, you wouldn't have received it. I didn't read it much, so even if you channeled my spirit, I wouldn't be able to reproduce it. Unfortunately, I can't bear to part with my life, otherwise, it definitely would have been interesting to see your disappointment. Klein calmly said. No, I won't be disappointed. I can obtain the soul and characteristic of a demoness of affliction. I can graze you and subdue you. As he spoke, he raised his left palm, which had creeping hunger on it. It was in the shape of a black glove. Tracy narrowed her eyes. The look in her eyes became extremely dangerous, like a provoked tiger. If not for the two high-sequence beyonders beside her, she might have already attacked. And the moment Klein finished his sentence, he noticed something amiss. I'm not acting as Gehrman Sparrow at the moment, so why am I speaking in accordance with his persona? Klein was alarmed as he suspected whether he had been too into character recently. Remember, you can only be yourself. I cannot be influenced by the character I act as, because of prolonged acting. This will cause me to become lost and result in losing control. He quickly reflected on himself, and added his conclusions into the acting principles of a faceless. Noticing his brief silence, Isaac looked at Katerina Pell and said in his usual tone, Can you copy a set of those documents for me? That's not a big problem. Katerina gave Tracy a glance. Any requests? Tracy stared at Klein and said with a clearly hoarse voice, Tell me where Helene is. Klein withdrew his thoughts and looked at her before looking at the pure demoness of unaging Katerina. He had already made his decision, but he couldn't help but feel hesitant. He turned to look at Mr. Isaac and discovered his warm smile. He wasn't urging him or forcing him. Klein retracted his gaze and simply said, I refuse.